learning how to work with do your shadow work, learning how to take responsibility for what you're creating, learning how to receive and give feedback, learning how to become your best self, all those kind of things, I think ultimately are the most radical things that we've been involved in. And unless we all recognize our essential natures, we can't have world peace. Like everything else will be a facsimile and will lead to eventual argument and breakdown. And the most important thing that the world needs is people to understand their true essential selves. Instead of him just trying to create a company out of that with a few board members, and primary investors who become billionaires because they own most of the company, so to say, his intentions are really to be a systemic planetary scale philanthropist, like as an innovation. How can I call people to leave capitalism or something? How can I call people to trust emergence if I don't really dive into that thing myself? It's going to use all these new technologies like decentralized thinking, holacracy type thinking. It's going to use omnicentric type thinking, altruistic principles and compassion. And let's just get on with it, like you're saying. Let's show the world what we're talking about and just make an invitation, period. It's just an invitation.
Welcome to Co-Emergence podcast, where we facilitate conversations for a better world. If you are interested in discovering more about what works in the world, then you are in the right place. We lead a collective inquiry into the best ideas and practices that enable people, organizations, and systems to function in greater harmony with the world. Follow our podcast and take part in the conversation at co-emergence.org. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Co-Emergence podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and I have Bret Warshawsky today as our guest. He's a concept architect who has spent the past 10 years deeply immersed in the embodied research, design, and development of disruptive stories, new realities, and spirit-motivated social architectures and sociotechnologies. While he has many creative outlets, his life work includes two specific missions. First one, to help spark a rebirth and renaissance for philanthropy, leading to a new paradigm for how we produce and share the products, the goods, and the services of the world. And secondly, to catalyze systemic mental health reformation. Welcome, Bret. That sounds like quite a bit of a journey, and I'm so delighted to have you here today. And I wonder, out of all of your wealth of experience, what has been the most maybe radical experience and radical kind of maybe practice that could be implemented on a wider scale across the world?
Thank you, Alex, first of all, for inviting me onto the podcast. I'm honored to be here and to be your friend and to be of support of this work that you and your co-hosts want to do in the world. So I'm really happy to be able to contribute. Yeah. And to respond to the first question you asked there. I tend to focus when asked a question like this on the nature of self-inquiry, of spiritual transformation, and how that ultimately may be the most radical thing that I and my friends and my network and the people that we've been engaged with really have been up to. So on one half of the coin, you might say, or one half of the of the of the Tao, you've got the yang, right? The active and the masculine, let's say, and the doing and the becoming and all that. And that's where a lot of the systems and social architectures and all those kind of things that we've been involved in, I've been involved with are, and that's all radical, so to say, or a lot of people use the word disruptive technologies or innovative and words like pioneering and things like that. And there's no doubt that that's part of the resume, so to say. But I always tend to fall back on thinking the most radical thing that I've been doing and that we've been doing is the the personal work and the what we call the alchemy between ourselves and with each other, and bringing that to different groups and to different spaces. Um, and that's because it's the hard it's on some levels the most challenging thing to do, and I would say it's probably the most fundamental um, aspect of all of our lives in some sense, especially to our work. To speak from my own, my own eye. So it's kind of like we want to grow all these things in the garden. We want to grow new systems and new technologies and new ways of being and new ways of helping and sharing and all these things. But it, the soil needs to be healthy, right? The soil needs to be conducive to the sprouting of those kind of flowers and those kind of and that kind of pasture, maybe you might say. Um, And even if we look at the world as it is today, with the soil being overlooked, losing all of its nutrients, and from the ecological environmental perspective, that's one of the major problems. Despite all the carbon and all these other things, the soil, the actual soil that our food grows in, is really damaged. And I'm not an expert in that, so I'm just using it as a metaphor. So I think the soil of personal growth, and then personal growth in the context of different geometries, like between me and a couple of founders when we first started, and then we met three or four more people. So how are you doing what we call social alchemy together, what our friends call creatorhood? So learning how to work with do your shadow work, learning how to take responsibility for what you're creating, learning how to receive and give feedback, learning how to become your best self, all those kind of things, I think ultimately are the most radical things that we've been involved in, and that leads to some other things, but I'll leave it there for the moment so we can build off that perhaps.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I really see how that could be the most radical part because there are so many different views on that, and it's such a contentious area, isn't it? Our nature and our potential as well. And we have these different paradigms, I guess, almost in competition with each other. The scientific, the kind of very hardcore scientific paradigm, and then we have the spiritual paradigms, right? And I can really see the the radicalness of that conversation, and I am really excited to also delve into that if we have a chance. And you also, prior to our recording today, said that you would be happy to continue the conversation over several episodes. So possibly, if we don't get the chance to get to this topic today, then in some of the following episodes. And so basically, the soil that you're referring to is the individuals, right? Like out of which all the other structures and systems and societies can arise. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'm gonna expand on that in a minute, maybe not directly. So the answer is yes, and I guess I would say, because one of my other passions for my whole life, but it also coming back to me more strongly lately, the last few months and few weeks even, is really even the nature of existence, the nature of what I'm into, like what's called Advaita Vedanta, like non-duality kind of frameworks and all that. And I've even been thinking, how do I bring that into some of the innovations that we've been working on? So yes, to the individuals being the actual primary movers and shakers of systems. So I often think the idea of a group is almost a fiction to me, because what we really mean by a group is a collection of real, like solid individuals. Like, we often get lazy, let's say sometimes, or we use shortcuts. Language is like a shortcut. So we say, like, the Jewish people, or the minority people, or the Catholics, or
Yeah.
the African American, whatever it is. These are words that don't really describe anything. They're like these generalities. So I often think they're almost like fictions, this idea of a collective, so to say. Um, so, yes, I believe the real individuals are the most important thing, the each unique contribution of those individuals. And then when those individuals get together, there's, the synergy, the whole that's greater than the sum of those parts. But I am certainly a fan of, or somewhat of a believer in, focusing on the individual. And then that's why I had a little bit of the hesitancy. Really, I think I'm interested in that infinite awareness, this ground of
Mm,
being that some people call consciousness or spirit or awareness. And from that point of view, that's where we're all actually this one being. So I don't mean to be metaphysically abstruse or whatever. I mean, it's a real experience for me to say that we're all individual expressions of this one infinite awareness. So even as these individuals, we're almost a collective. Like we're all like, these expressions of this one infinite awareness. So it's really an interesting topic, even so to say, but it can get a little philosophical. So we'll see if we can springboard from it. But that is on my mind. I will say it's important to me, especially lately, thinking about. Um, I saw a video of a non-dual teacher who I happen to appreciate, and he said in basically in 35 seconds, in his opinion, unless we all recognize our essential natures, we can't have world peace. Like everything else will be a facsimile and will lead to eventual argument and breakdown. And the most important thing that the world needs is people to understand their true essential selves, and that's like the fundamental reality of the revolution, that's happening. Um, Again, going back to this idea of what is the ground, what is the soil. Um, I think it starts with that infinite awareness, and there's many ways to look at that spirit, like a lens of spirituality, a lens of scientism, lens of ecology. So it doesn't have to be just spiritual, so to say. But from there is where the individuals and the collective rise up out of that infinite awareness. Is I guess what I'm saying. Like the individual may not even be the root, the root element, the
yeah,
root thing. Yeah.
and it's quite interesting because one of like the basic intention of having these conversations is to have this collective inquiry, right? Like, what is a better world? Can we consciously define it and choose it and create it, right? And if we were to do that, it's almost like to what extent we can engage the collective for that future. Is it a minority group that over time grows, or can we actually create from the outset a pretty sizable group that aligns on what that future is could be, and even not necessarily like implements it, but even engages their local current political system, right? And slowly transform the system from within, but in a very clearly defined way, like clearly have this vision that we're moving towards. And on the most fundamental level, as you're saying, the teacher that inspires you says, well, you cannot have world peace without that fundamental realization of our nature, right? And can we actually put that as a hypothesis, like we must have that, and then build from there as a collective? And yet the challenge there, just in this one acorn of a thought, is like,
Mm.
well, can we agree on what a fundamental nature of a human being is as a society? Because there are so many different views, right? So this is really just like an open question, right? And we've opened up just in these few minutes so many different aspects of a conversation. And to me, that's also one of the qualities that we as a society could develop, is ability to have these multi-dimensional conversations where we understand that we cannot look at one aspect, one topic, one problem in isolation, right? It's all systemic, right? It connects with so many other parts. And I would love to start actually from the bigger picture and then see what patterns we can establish in that bigger picture, and then maybe pick one of those possible scenarios and then start moving in a more grounded, practical sense. And just to preface that, I will say in a few words, like, it seems to me that the environment nowadays is full of these challenges and problems that we're facing as as a society in the world. And um, for many people it creates stress. And if you were to go, like, if you're really stressed out and if you were to hire a coach or a therapist, any good coach or therapist would ultimately lead you to actually focusing on what you want, not on your problems, right? So, and it's kind of the same inquiry. Can we focus on what we want? Can we establish a clear vision of the whole society's movement into the future. And what happens when we close our eyes and we imagine, where is the world going? And when I closed my eyes some years ago, I was scared, right? I was like, well, do I even want to be here for that future that is portrayed to us? And then I started seeing these visionaries, these projects popping up, on the internet through my network and different sources and books. And I was getting hopeful. I was actually seeing that amongst all of this mist and fog of scary information, there's hope. And you've been around in the space for quite a long time. And I wonder if you see that there are certain groups of people who are maybe building a vision that is somewhat overlapping in some ways, but maybe somewhat distinct. And outline for us who those groups are and what do you see, what have you come to understand they suggest for our future?
Mm. Okay, thanks, Alex. I should have been taking some notes.
It'll
um,
be recorded, so that's fine.
um, I mean, what comes to mind for me, I'm gonna kind of speak to a couple of points that you first brought up, but I'm not gonna dwell there too much. There's just a couple quotes and feelings I wanted to preface a full answer to your question with. Um, One is Buckminster Fuller has a quote that we are called to be architects of the future and not its victims. There's the famous quote by Margaret Mead, never doubt a small group of people can like do the impossible. That's how it's always been. And I'm paraphrasing that, by the way. um, and my all-time possibly favorite inspiring quote is by Howard Thurman, which is, "Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is more people that have come alive." So I'm speaking. I was just reading, like in science, sometimes they have this thing called the ontological primitive. It's like the fundamental axiom or belief that is on the table that informs like the rest of your worldview or the rest of your hypothesis or something like that. So in that sense, I have a bias, like a paradigm of my own, and it really is influenced by these types of ontological primitives that we're I'm not here to fix the world, so to say, or save the world. I'm here, and I'm saying this based on something you shared, to create the world that I want to live in. Like you said, it's instead of focusing on the problems or the victimhood, which again goes to the consciousness and all that, instead of seeing myself as a victim where the world is happening to me and all these things are happening to me, I want to be an architect of the future, not its victims. I want to create the future by doing it, not by predicting it. I want to create the world I want to live in. And I don't want to fix it and feel like a savior or a sacrifice. Like I'm here because I feel excited and I want to live a certain way and all that. So that informs anything I will be sharing, so to say, and which is just nice to kind of put on the table. I'm an optimist in that way. um, Although it is based on, like you said, it is based on my own practice and praxis and traveling around the world and meeting awesome people and awesome projects. So I use that as a little bit of a transition. Um, I have been around pretty awesome, and I'm an iceberg as well. I mean, a tip of an iceberg. I have hardly seen anything to some degrees. Like no matter how much I have traveled and how many awesome people I run into in projects, the amazing part is it's only like this much of a spectrum, which is great because I'm like a little voice on some of the things that I've seen.
And that's where the
With
collective element comes in, right? Like,
yeah,
we all, by putting it together, our experiences, our perspectives can, if we act in some kind of coherence, I guess, and coordination, become that full iceberg. So yeah, it's exciting.
and I think well maybe we'll come back to this. I'll just say it before I go into some of the projects and people and whatnot, what I've seen and what I'm looking at. I think what will end up uniting, I do think it is potentially a certain subset of people and projects, which is not because of exclusion. I think if we look at the patterns of nature and history and all things like that, like new ideas, new inventions, even new technologies, whether they're literacy, even, I mean, there's some people call those psychotechnologies, like numeracy and literacy are actually what are called psychotechnologies and psychedelic, all these different things. And then there's harnessing fire and electromagnetic energy, all that, like, there's never been an instance where all people on the planet like understood or were creating those new things together at once on a practical level. Maybe like, in the existential realm, we're all one, so we're all creating it. But to speak practically, so to say, and I don't think that's about exclusion. It seems to be almost a fact of life, a fact of existence. There often is a small group of people or a small culture that becomes then the dominant or the status quo culture. So um, I I do. I mean, for me, it goes back to a lineage for thousands of years of like mystics and evolutionary type people that are always seeing like what's ahead of the curve or what's coming. And I do think there are some kind of principles that are uniting and patterns that are uniting everyone more than any specific project or any specific mission. The principle of emergence, the principles of collective intelligence, the principles of a gift paradigm, principles of co-creation, principles of interconnection, of compassion. Like I think those are the things that are like the strange attractors, that are drawing the people and projects that might, like you're saying, produce an actual new reality or a new economic system or a new education system. So I'm sure that could go a lot deeper, but that was how I was just feeling about that's what I feel is drawing everyone together. It is actually metaphysical and philosophical and intentional and energetic architecture that some people call it, like energetic architecture. So before we would build social architectures, which are more about implementing how we want to behave with each other and co-create together, and then technological architectures like systems and whether permaculture or internet technologies, those architectures really are on top of like an energetic architecture, which is a lot of us are resonating with, which are kind of principles based and things like that. So that's my little preface. Thanks for listening to that. I think it's important to kind of just put that out there, and I'm excited to have way more conversations. I hope to be back with you guys and meet some of your other future guests and really get into. I'm kind of longing for that kind of space, so I'm excited to hopefully help you and be part of a live, ongoing conversation. I don't necessarily fit my eccentric character doesn't always fit with other pioneering things, even though they're pioneering. I'm still a little bit of a black sheep, so it'd be nice to have a forum, a
That's the
live
beauty.
forum like this. Yeah,
Exactly.
where
Different
where
perspective.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So as far as projects and people, I started out like 9 years ago with my wife now, Andrea, and a former partner of ours named Chris, creating a prototype software called Noomap, Noomap. Chris brought like an alpha version of his software into a space with me and Andrea, so we were kind of a trifecta, and we all had different gifts, and we set out to what we thought at the time was build a platform for co-creation. Um, and we'll get into that another time because it's a nice, beautiful, long story. But because of that impetus, because of us coming together, the first thing that happened was some people saw like one of our first communications and introduced us to Barbara Marx Hubbard, for example. So we started talking to Barbara, who is a lineage holder, like a pioneer. I mean, a woman who lived to, I think, 90, and knew Bucky Fuller and Timothy Leary, and has been talking about co-creation and conscious evolution for 40 years. She ran for vice president in 1984, so she was really way ahead of her time. So and then we ended up at like the Uplift Festival in Australia, and magical things kind of happen when you follow your bliss and you kind of leap into the abyss of trust. And because we were into technology at first, we of course ran into other technology. Well, we people thought we were mostly into technology because we had this sort of fancy software prototype with an interface, and it was easy to assume we were like a unicorn type of Silicon Valley startup. Like, oh yeah, go to Silicon Valley. But we were spiritually oriented. I mean, we all met through synchronicity and trust and all that. So our platform was always about co-creation, which involves, like you're saying, all the quadrants, if you will, of the AQUAL of Ken Wilber, We look at all the quadrants, like collective intelligence, all the pieces of a puzzle, etc. So we never set out just to build a new internet software or web application. We set out to really build new systems that make the old ones obsolete, as Bucky says. So because of that initial impulse of being spiritually oriented, technologically oriented, and like systems oriented, we of course over the years have run into or co-created or work with people who have projects in all these different sectors, really. So, the Holochain crew we're friendly with, which is, an advanced kind of distributed ledger technology. There's Threefold out of Egypt who are building a decentralized internet. There's our friend David, who's got an internet platform called Our World. There's the Seeds platform, regenerative payment, new currency out of, well, it's kind of decentralized. It's out of everywhere, but a lot of them happen to be in Bali at the moment. So there's a bunch of core network, Adam Apollo and Harlan out of the US. So there's all those projects. And then, of course, philosophically, people are connected to people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall and the evolutionary existential crew there. Through Barbara Marx Hubbard, we met some of the more elder statespeople of conscious evolution, like Irvin Laszlo, systems theorist, and a few other people. And a lot of grassroots. We tend to focus more on the grassroots, black sheep, I would say, super eccentric, super who have stepped out of, the system as it is, which goes back to the original soil question. And the other half of my answer, actually, which is the most radical thing we've done, is said no to the things that we believe are to be said no to, like venture capital, capitalism itself. So I'm not saying those things are bad, and I'm not othering them. I'm just saying in our world, in our value system, those were antiquated things that were so flawed, they weren't really in alignment with the new things we wanted to create. So going on this journey in the spirit of what we call gifting, and one of my life's work of spiritual philanthropy and co-creation and trusting and using really a resource-based economy, so to say, and all that kind of stuff, is the other half of the most radical thing we've done, which is stick to our intuitions and our deep evolutionary purpose, to be way showers and to eventually come around the other side to build new tools and organizations and systems that actually give people the opportunity to have these experiences. And really it all comes down to, how can we build those things if we don't go through that experience? So that's the research, design, development. It's possible to get a download for an equation like Nikola Tesla did. He kind of just got the blueprint for AC, and all. But how can I call people to leave capitalism or something? How can I call people to trust emergence if I don't really dive into that thing myself? So that's the other half of the radicalness. And there's just tons of projects and people. I feel like there's no reason to make a bullet list. We can hopefully, because of your question, I can weave in, like, oh, over here they've been doing this, through our conversation. I think that would probably be the most truthful way to name all of those things. But there's certainly something happening, in my opinion, and there's different levels of cutting edge, like different depths of cutting edge and pioneering. But I am just, again, I do add the spiritual dimension in, destiny, karma, all those kind of things, and evolutionary impulse. And I believe the universe, consciousness, wants to have a type of experience where everyone wins and there's peace and creativity and prosperity, all these things. I actually think it has purpose, so to say. The universe, maybe they call it telos or telios or something like that. So for me, there's something happening. There's something that wants to happen, and there's a lot of people, amazing people, on the case of that, including yourself, by doing this.
And it definitely feels like there are these pockets of initiatives appearing all over the place, right? Regardless of the continent or even the philosophical background or anything like that, right? So there's many directions we could go from here, right? So one of the things also that I've been contemplating on is we now have this almost single banner label for the agenda that is, more or less like the main agenda of today by the big politics, as we could call it, and the big NGOs, right? Like the World Health Organization and the UN, who are not elected by the people of the countries. And I don't know whether you have come across, but they call it the Great Reset. And it's like this nice slogan that is almost catchy, that has a certain ideology, of course, to it, that has a certain message to it, and has certain marketing to it, which obviously then taps into people's unconscious also desires and biases and emotions. And it's all very coordinated. It's all very, flashy, and obviously, there's lots of big names. Now, what I'm getting at is, on the other side, there are these small pockets, people, grassroots, little backing sometimes, working from their initiative and their passion. It seems like there's a huge counterbalance there, right? Like it's almost that the game is rigged. How do you see that? Is it just a matter of time where those initiatives simply need a little bit of time and it's going to develop and it's going to potentially become this more mainstream movement and more people are going to find out about it? Or will it really take something different and some coordination, some similar maybe slogan and banner and marketing almost, not in this crude way, right? But something that we can unite over, something that we can um, digest as well mentally, because our capacity to deal with complex information is limited, and sometimes it seems overwhelming. It's like I need to know about all these philosophies. I need to know about all of these technologies, like blockchain and all of that. Like sometimes it may seem it's like too much. Oh, just I'm going to get on with my regular life. Just stop bothering me about this, right? So where do you see this going in the future?
Well, it seems to me, so I'll use those words specifically. It seems to me that the Great Reset crowd, I'll use that, and I use that word lightly. Again, like that's a very generalized term. The Great Reset crowd and like the Davos, World Economic Forum crowd. I mean, if you think in terms of even like a non-spiritual version of the law of attraction, right? I'm not talking. I'm not going to get. I'm not. I don't need to get into like metaphysics, but people tend to flock together that like the same things. Like why does everyone work for a sport? The New York Yankees. They probably like baseball and sports and competition and business, so they found the perfect way to, express themselves in the context that they live in. And everyone who is attracted to the New York Yankees organization has something in common, probably, or people in the dining industry, whatever it is. I think even if you're not into this law of attraction idea or something, people can understand. Like we get attracted to our same kind of people, the same thoughts and the same ideas and all that. And I think that's part of the story. I personally think the Great Reset and the Davos crowd and all that is dangerous. Like I'll be honest, I think it's dangerous. I think it's filled with dogma, greed, and a lot of really dangerous ideas and dangerous people, and it's not going to be able to provide a true path forward. I think it's going to a lot of things like they do, it looks good on paper, like you're saying. It says all the right things, and maybe in the short term, an initiative will bear like fruit that looks good and reasonable. But I'm very cautious, if anything, around those initiatives and the people that might be involved. And I tend to use that. Maybe it's a Bible quote, right? Like knowing people or things by the fruits of their labor. Like, what have they produced? And, everyone that goes to Davos flies on a private jet, and has billions of dollars, but doesn't really give it to any other, like other projects, like you're saying, like Game B type projects or our project. They give it to the same NGOs and pharmaceutical companies and carbon neutral companies that are all working. I mean, again, not really going to get into like the conspiracy space, but there's truth to some of those things, or else it wouldn't really. Where there's smoke, there's fire, as far as I'm concerned. And I think there's a lot of bad intentions in those spaces, and then people with those same intentions go to the same place, and then it's like a snowball of like some pretty unhealthy things. That doesn't mean there's not awesome people involved and all that kind of stuff. So I'm talking about it as an engine, as a monolithic thing. I'm not really super attracted to it, and I do think there's actually, practically speaking, a lot of dangerous stuff in there, from like transhumanism type of agendas and population reduction agendas. Again, not speaking to the real deep dystopian stuff, even on a practical level. I feel like it's not a healthy place, and it just repeats the same patterns, and of dominance and other things like that. I often joke, when you see our Bret Minster full of it at Davos, when you see our Bret Minster full of it, our Bret Warshawsky, at a Great Reset panel talking about emergence and spiritual philanthropy, and someone stepping up to give in a different way to catalyze something other than what they're used to doing, then I'll be more, oh, I would be more curious, and I would be more interested and more positive, about what might be in those spaces, because it's very exclusive, in my opinion, and very close-minded and very monochromatic, you know. Um, so that's a long-winded. I mean, thanks for your patience. A long-winded answer to the first part of that, but I feel like I would be dishonest if I didn't like put it on the table. And I'm open. I'm curious. If somebody sees this interview and and wants to invite me and my friends and all of us to come to the table and integrate somehow or co-create, I wouldn't say no to that whatsoever. I would go and explore. So I don't feel really dismissive or cut off. I'm just being honest simultaneously about my actual assessment of what actually those things are. And I can answer the second part, like kind of what can we do? Like what is an alternative to that, so to say? And how do we become that, the famous quote, we need to organize for peace like those who organize for war. So I can shift into that. I'll just ask you first, did you want to reflect or relate to anything, or should I just, tune into the kind of second half of your question? I realize I took a lot of time to answer that, but I just felt like I just wanted to say it.
Yeah, and again, it outlines so many other areas of exploration potentially. And one thing that um, seems possibly important to mention is that in the spirit of this idea of dialectic, right? Instead of a debate or a dialogue, a dialectic being that we actually try to establish the truth from both sides and then synthesize it into something new. In that spirit, it also seems like there must be, right, some value and some truth. And it's really just about that, to what seems to me an absence of the dialogue, of the conversation between the public and the architects of that future, right? It seems very predetermined. It seems like, well, we tell you that this is going to be the future and you're going to love it and you must accept it. Well, what about this? What about that detail? What about the other detail? Well, can we tweak it somehow here, right? Can we take this part but change another part to something else? That doesn't seem to be happening, right? And as you're saying quite rightly, it's about inviting different perspectives to have the dialogue and the dialectic, conversation, ultimately. And um, hopefully this can be created as parts of the podcast here in this space. And yeah, I would love to hear someone from even that, if they even consider us as at any point someone worthy to have a conversation with, right? But the idea is, yeah, just to integrate whatever is good and take it to, into the future, right? So yeah, that's my little reflection.
Yeah,
Thank you for
thank you.
listening and turning to that.
Yeah. Um, so let's see if you can kind of flag me. I think I'm going to respond in a way that starts to address your other kind of half of that question. And if it kind of doesn't, just kind of like break in and bring me back, so to say, or, mold it into where you want to go. Um, my experience is one of my friends used to have a saying, in time, on time. Like everything is in time, on time. And part of the value set of co-creation, let's say, or emergence and a new paradigm and systems thinking, complexity theory, all these kind of things, cybernetic, the new physics, it's kind of understood that things happen when they're meant to or when they can. Like there's sometimes a sequence, like when an embryo is forming, it doesn't just create the liver right away. It has like a process, a sequence to becoming an organism, so to say. Um, so I think that's part of the story of new paradigms and new innovations and new ideas, coming online. Like there is a collective consciousness, so to say, that is involved too. It's not just what Bret wants, or what Bret and Alex want, or what Game B wants. Like there's like what is the famous saying, like for every season there's a time, and for every whatever, et cetera, et cetera. Um, my experience is that this new Barber called it universalis, like this new breed of human or this new breed of consciousness, this new society, whatever it is, it it's coming and it will be implemented and it will have marketing, like you're saying, it will have marketing. Like it may not look like what we're used to, like you're saying, make one flag, like the Great Reset or America. It may be more decentralized or what I call omni-centralized and co-creative and inclusive, etc. But for me, it's coming. No, number one. Number two, it will be funded, it will be resourced to reach its goals, just as, at some point, Apple and Microsoft were, glints in those guys' eyes. And then one day they did this, and then one day they got their first round of funding or something, and then et cetera. Like these things have trajectories. And I think if we're fair about society shift and how long the planet's been evolving in 14 billion years in the age of this, in the Bronze Age, like it's easy to get our expectations up, or to want something to happen like now, now, now. But a lot of what we're discussing here and what a lot of people in our space discuss is also subject to like evolutionary type principles and long-term thinking and things like that. So I am very optimistic that capacity will continue to build. There's something called the Maharishi effect where they did experiments, like where 10% of people meditated and it kind of reduced crime in Washington, D.C. or something like that. And then there's like Moore's law of technology, like the transistor doubles every year, et cetera, et cetera. So poetically speaking, I think we're dealing with a Moore's law of consciousness here, of evolution. I think we're dealing with a type of Maharishi effect, so to say. And what we're all doing, those who are in these pockets that you're talking about, who are on the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of exploration, we're really like explorers, which is part of the bargain. You go into some uncertainty and trust in things like that. I think our time in that sense is coming. Um, I mean, for example, we have a friend in our network to share about another project who's working on a financial software that's kind of like a bot, like it plays the cryptocurrencies and stocks and commodities. And it's based on certain algorithms and AI and all that. And instead of him just trying to create a company out of that with a few board members, and primary investors who become billionaires because they own most of the company, so to say, his intentions are really to be a systemic planetary scale philanthropist, like as an innovation. So he's brought together some of people like us who have been looking at systems for how you would share resources and how you would get along and co-create together, how projects would be able to interface with each other and work as a whole system together. So, I don't know if that's going to come online in a few months or if it will, it has to work, it has to test itself. But just as an example, that could generate enough funding for literally a whole game B. I mean, it's tremendous amount. And it's all about the intentions behind the person who created it and what his intentions are. And if one person is thinking like that, why won't there be then two and three? That's part of also this. I'm sure you've seen, Alex. Like, that's what's infiltrating to me. Our consciousness as a whole species, like altruism. Even science has shown like the survival of the fittest is really one interpretation. Like that's not necessarily true. Like we only survive by competing and things like that. So all of these things are like seeping in, and there's no reason to me whatsoever why we won't reach the points you're talking about of mass availability, of accessibility. And the example, I'll end on this. The example I like to use is I believe on some level evolution or the universe has had a bit of a speed limit on its capacity. If you gave Bret Warshawsky $4 billion 10 years ago, would I have done something positive with that? Or would I have done something maybe even more destructive than positive? Would I have known how to be most optimal with that? And the reason I say that is, as the time comes for a lot of the people and projects I know, if they're given hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars in the system available to them to build the things they're talking about, it's a radical shift. It's, to me, metaphorically, a pole shift. It will put Amazon out of business. Maybe that sounds, I don't know if that sounds ambitious or egotistical. I'm just saying the types of systems and models and innovations and the consciousness behind them in all the spaces I'm talking about that you're asking about, it's seismic. It's really, really disruptive, and really, really scary to most people, and especially the people who are currently in charge of things, for lack of a better word. So therefore, there's a time and space for that. And the example is something called WeWork. If you've ever looked up, or any of your audience, this guy out of, I think, Israel originally, but a US citizen, he got $4.4 billion to create that thing called WeWork. So overnight, there was WeWork offices all over the planet, like within a month. Nothing called WeWork. And then within a month, it's everywhere. And there's a marketing campaign for it. So I don't see why our time won't come where 10 million, 5 million, 20 million, 50, whatever it is, where, in my language, synergy hubs pop up all over the planet. And synergy hubs are having a different conversation, a different working environment. And instead of people competing for resources to bring their beautiful innovations to the world in service, there's no competition. Everyone has what they need in order to bring their gifts and their innovations to the world. The only competing is how many wealthy people can compete to give the most amount of resources to the people who want to help make a better world. So, again, thanks for listening, Alex. But I am quite passionate about it. And I'm very optimistic about that side of the coin. Um, yeah, I believe it's coming, man. I really do. It's just things happen when they happen.
So it sounds like it's about this disruptive technology or disruptive solution that will come at one point and change the game. Would you say that's a fair expectation, or fair, I guess, hope as well to some extent?
I think going back to the poetry of Moore's effect and Moore's law and Maharishi effect, I think it's actually consciousness's capacity gaining strength and clarity and coherence and momentum so that it can give birth to not only one message or one disruptive innovation, it's the consciousness that's truly disruptive. And because it's consciousness that's disruptive, it's grounded, it's embodied in not desire or phony need or marketing for telling people what they need or telling people how it's going to be. This bedrock of of evolutionary consciousness is what is disruptive, and that is the ground of from which many disruptive innovations come online. I would say it looks like mycelial mushroom network. So I'm not an expert at that, but I know mushrooms like pop out of the ground at a certain point after being underground. So I believe at some point my parents, God bless them, hopefully they're still here, will wake up someday in the next year, 2 years, whatever is meant to be, and they'll be like, where in the hell did this come from? Where did all of these synergy hubs come from? Where did this platform for co-creation come from? How are they growing food that's feeding the whole city? And how is it just that all the major cities in the whole world now have this new device that brings, and like, I think it's more going to flourish like in this omnicentric, distributed fashion. And that is the only way that it could actually have the type of impact that you're kind of alluding to, rather than the one pointed bottleneck, like point of failure, like one innovation. So, unless consciousness is that one disruptive innovation, which I think ultimately we're talking about, um, and I'd like to talk with more people about that as well as you bring more people along. For me, that kind of gets left out a lot in some of the game B type conversations and inquiries. It tends to focus more on material, like materialization and material and matter, at a little bit at the expense of the other half of that coin, which the game B crowd is not resistant to, I would say. If you listen to Daniel Schmachtenberger, they're certainly not resistant to love or anti-consciousness, but I still think it's quite male dominated and material like dominated. So I would love to also have a balanced inquiry with people that are super specialist in actually creating systems and innovations and businesses, so to say, with the non-dualists. Like the scientist and the non-dualist together is what really excites me. All together, the mystics and the scientists, we're all part of the same effort. And until that's respected and understood, it's going to be hard. But I've seen a lot of change there too, by the way, Alex, with people saying, "Oh, Brett, I love it. You're a futurist," right? Instead of saying I'm unpractical or I'm not grounded, it's like, "Oh, that's your role. That you're here to talk about this and represent this and to stand for this. You're devoted to the world you've seen 100 years from now and trying to get that world to manifest in 5 years." And I love that. And I can equally say, yeah, and I respect that you're a lawyer or a doctor. And this is what your mission is here. And your mission is to be a translator of Brett's futuristic ideas into something that my mom could understand. Everyone is really part of that. So, which is exciting too.
Right, and the very last point that you were saying also reminds me of this idea of emergence, right? Like what is emergence? In simple terms, it's different things coming together and integrating and forming something else that didn't exist before, right? Like the most simple example being water, right? Two molecules of hydrogen, a molecule of oxygen, boom, there's water, right? Well, that's also what you're saying. It's like, well, you have a role, I have a role, everyone has a role. And if we are able to fill our own shoes rather than try to fill somebody else's shoes, it seems to me there's more likelihood that something can emerge out of that more harmonious and beautiful, right?
Yeah.
And
I
there's a
mean, wouldn't
whole
that be radical, Alex, if we all listen to each other?
right, yeah.
If we all listen to each other, and I'm guilty of this as anyone, by the way, so like I never put myself above above the fray of learning. This is again going back to our opening. What have I been learning most? What have we been doing the most radical? Is learning how to get out of our own way, learning how to listen, learning how to like notice when we're getting triggered or angry and why that's our business and not to blame the other person. This is the most radical thing we can do. If you can get a bunch of multi cross disciplinary, eccentric, artists and scientists to come together and give them a platform to listen to each other before they decide who's right and wrong, or who's accurate, or who's got the right PhD to be commenting on that. That's the most radical thing we can almost do.
Yeah, and that's one of the intentions and a dream as well, that it can be possible on this platform. So looking forward to that taking place. So one of the things as well that you've touched upon multiple times is consciousness, and I would like to go to that. And just before we do that, maybe wrap up the whole systemic level conversation. One reflection from what you were saying, that seems also maybe a conversation for another time, but I will outline it here, is when I was asking you about this, what was it? I've forgotten now. The agenda. What was it called? It's
The
so
Great
irrelevant.
Reset.
Yeah, the Great Reset. It's so irrelevant to me that I have to try to remember it. And what you were saying, the development of these new initiatives and systems is omnicentric. And I realized, well, maybe it's not about what is going to be the banner and the marketing campaign of the new systems. Well, it's actually omnicentric, right? So maybe we don't know what that looks like yet. And maybe if we look for the right things, we're going to see them more clearly. Maybe we're just looking for the wrong things, right? And on a practical level, it kind of ties in with my question that I would like to ask you is, what do you see as the most useful thing that could happen in this space that could accelerate the development of these initiatives and systems and technologies?
Do you mean like on an in my face day to day level, or compared to like, I mean, the most useful thing would be like Jesus to come down and everyone be like, "Oh, wait, there's something more than we thought that was going on in the world." So I'm joking, but I guess can we? I guess, is it okay if I confine it to something like super, like, you know, I don't know, tangible or something
Please, yeah.
like I want to ask you something. What is the inspiration for that question?
The
What
inspiration.
is the yeah, what is like the, and I'm not asking to be antagonistic. I want to delve a little bit. Like, yeah, what is like the inspiration slash motivation for asking, quote unquote, what's the most useful thing that could possibly maybe happen like right now?
I think part of that is definitely one of our cornerstones, which is practicality. Is like we've had this sort of somewhat big, well, definitely big picture and somewhat some level of abstraction conversation, right? And really, if we bring it down to the day to day life, where maybe someone could orient their profession or orient their choices that they make towards something that they know will bring the most value to the society and the betterment of the society as a whole.
Mm.
And that's, yeah, I think, does that, is that fair answer?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there doesn't have to be an answer. I'm just teasing out a little bit. Like,
Mm. It feels like that's the gist. Yeah.
I mean, I guess to tie thing, to keep tying things together. Part of me wants to say the most useful thing that any one person can do is to know thyself, like to know themselves. My premise is because if you take that seriously, like if you actually put a devotion and energy into that, as if you would like your hobbies, or your sport, or your vocation, or whatever. If you And I'm speaking from experience, because inquiry is actually like literally my vocation, based on my life story, which we can touch base, another conversation, and how it would all interrelate, etc. Um, because when people know that themselves, and this is my premise, so to say, like I can't prove this, or I know it from my own experience, but I would never say it's going to be the same for someone else. They'd have to do the experiment basically of self-knowing and practices for that. But my premise or my experiences is that the more people know their true self, know themselves, the more likely they are to do the things you're talking about, like to add value to the world, to make moral like choices, to be altruistic, to be peaceful and happy about what about and optimistic. So I know like maybe that sounds like simple or like boring or like not the answer, but part of me is like, isn't that been our problem as a species? That we keep trying to fix things or change things from the outside in. Whereas thousands of years of wisdom and mysticism and even and religion and all that has been saying, as my friends have a quote, internal cause, external effect, right? Internal cause, change your inside and you'll have an external effect that's different. So become more peaceful and joyful, and you'll probably create a more peaceful, joyful business, even if it's a business of 5 people doing, bricklaying, whatever. And if you create a better business together, those 5 people will have what they need. They'll go into the world and take better care of people and maybe be philanthropists too and help people. So it really isn't trivial or silly, to say that's the greatest thing anyone can do or the civilization can do. And then with my practical, like instead of useful, practical, like the most practical thing, and I'm slightly biased because I have some personal stuff around it. So I'm not sure it's 100% clean, but when I think of the word practical, the most practical thing would be to influx. Influx. I'm just going to use it loosely. The game B paradigm, even though I'm not crazy about that, by the way. Like I don't want to be. I'm just using it for a tool here. I don't like game B is the only alternative, or like it's the thing that has all these answers. But is to get an influx of resources into these initiatives and projects and people, so we're more easily able and more practically efficiently able to create the necessary and sufficient conditions to demonstrate all the innovation. So to demonstrate what the consciousness looks like, what it looks like to be in community around these things, to demonstrate actual growing of mass amounts of food, to demonstrate new energy device, whatever that is. That's the most, if you said practical, like literally, like I could wave my hand, other than consciousness shift and all that being most fundamental, I would say like the most practical thing um would be for a bunch of us to get together and have one of the conversations be, how can we inspire some people like that guy who inspired WeWork? He met a Japanese guy, who invested 4.4 billion, by the way. Now he invested it for an ROI, but I like the part of the story where the investor said to the guy, I need you to be crazier. There's more money where that came from. Now, where he was saying it from a perspective of the old paradigm and probably a lot of greed, and like he's the one guy who's making all the money from it. But the spirit of like, I need you to dream crazier, and there's plenty more money where that came from. Like, who's our guy, our set of guys, or set of a people that are going to want show up and say to us, I don't need a business plan full. I don't need to understand everything. I need you to dream bigger. Here's a blank check, and there's more where that came from. Practically speaking, I would like to see that. And then the other half of that is because we don't want to wait for other people to do that, or force people to have that awakening or want to do that. We're, like I said with our friend, we're directly working on having a solution so we can be the people that come to the table and say, actually, this is not a concern anymore. Let's start building a bunch of co-living, co-working spaces all around the planet. Let's get the food growing. It's all called, community land trust. It's going to be not owned by anyone specifically. It's going to use all these new technologies like decentralized thinking, holacracy type thinking. It's going to use omnicentric type thinking, altruistic principles and compassion. And let's just get on with it, like you're saying. Let's show the world what we're talking about and just make an invitation, period. It's just an invitation. So I'll end it with that. I love that word. I think the most important thing in the new paradigm or tier two and spiral dynamics is to make invitations. Like if we think we're going to force things on people or be the new great reset people, I don't want to find myself being the new great reset with a flashier set of words or dictating something. So it's all about creating the world we want to live in and making an invitation and demonstrating. And then people saying, "Wait, I would like to be part of that. That seems cool. How can I do that?" But if we don't have the resources or the synergy hubs all around the planet where we can say, "Oh, come spend a couple weeks. No cost to you. We'll even pay for your travel. You'll have healthy food. Don't worry about it. And when you leave, you don't have to go back to your whatever you consider to be your mundane or drudgery of you actually can be part of a community that will support you in becoming that." And that's radical, but that's practically what I'd like to see next. Period. I mean, if I'm just going to be like practically speaking, and maybe
Perfect.
this can be a forum, a little bit of a this is an invitation too for people who see this. Like, I do believe I know I would do it, treat others the way you want to be treated. Simple as that. Like, if I ever am steward of billions of dollars, this is what I'm going to do with it. Not that it's the only thing money. I'm just saying in that realm, that's what I
Sure.
would do. And I will do it. I've demonstrated it. We've demonstrated getting funding and resources through philanthropy and gifting on a small scale. Our projects have received over 300,000 in cash and millions in resources. Like we were given a building that was paid for a year, like skills and like coaching and healing. Like we've been sharing value, and like our contribution has been living the thing we're talking about and creating blueprints and creating prototype software and creating environments for people to have these experiences. So everyone has contributed to my journey. It's literally been a co-created gift paradigm journey that I've been on for 8 years. So I actually believe I talk from where like my experience. And it's the big question, like, how do I scale that up? How do we scale that up? Like you're saying, how do we make it mainstream? Because it is difficult. When it was three of us in a gift paradigm or gift economy, it was much easier for me as the logistics guy to go to the network and say, "Hey, can you put up three of us and help us out with, feed, put us up, for a couple of weeks so we can concentrate on our project, and we're going to be going to a conference." And it was much easier for someone to say, "Yeah, sure, we can help you," than if I said, "Well, I've got a team of 20 people coming." It was a little bit more hard to like scale that level of local generosity up, right? So that therefore we need to create the systems and the consciousness that is able to scale up, you know, co-creation and philanthropy and gifting and things like that. Yeah. Thanks for listening again, Alex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And again, we could go in so many different directions and topics from just what you shared. And I feel maybe we could pick one very specific, very narrow topic, and then we'll still branch out of it, but really focus on that and see what we can unfold and unravel in the process. So, and with regards to just that last point that you were saying, scaling and having more people involved, I've seen, I've come across, anyways, not too in depth, have researched, but like projects like time banks, right? I've seen them, but I haven't really seen them, if you know what I mean. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
they've proposed their idea. It seems good, but it's somehow not sticking. So is it that the design isn't quite there? Is it that there's not enough people, as you're saying? There's just the three people that sharing their time between themselves. What is it? Or does it require systemically some different structure for it to flourish, right? Or is it just an idea that we tried and tested, but it's, we learn from it and then we move on, right? And maybe, yeah, you have something to say to that.
Well, I would. It's funny. I think I'd probably put it the same way. I'm aware of time banking. I know it works under certain conditions, apparently, for certain groups of people to certain degrees for a certain amount of time. Like it, but it doesn't seem to reach any kind of what's the word, like critical mass or critical adoption. Um, I think there's a reason for that. I don't. I'm just going to state it, and then you can decide if you want to go further into this or take it in another, you know, very focused direction. I think it's because it's a flawed premise. Like it's a flawed. I mean, I don't mean to be mean, so maybe flawed's not the right word.
It's
It's not
incomplete.
fit for.
Ways
It's
we have.
incomplete. Incomplete. Is that what you said?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's. I think that's more appropriate. Like incomplete and or ultimately unsatisfying. Might feels even less pejorative or something than like flawed. It's like it feels like it's unsatisfying, and I think I like that. Like it feels unsatisfying to me, which is why I never did it. And I think the non-mass adoption of it is indicative of it being actually unsatisfying in as a paradigm. You know, like it's a tool. It seems to be a good tool, but like as a I mean, and that's why I would go. I don't want to go. I could go deeper. I think it has to do with transaction and ideas about value. But that's time banking. Like, really, if we went really deep. But yeah, what do you make of that anyway? That it feels unsatisfying to me. Like,
I love this, yeah, framing unsatisfying. So, as you were saying that, I'm wondering. So, you mentioned game B, although we haven't defined it, and maybe that would be one of the topics that we can go into a little bit more detail and then look at the whole premise of that. And but as you were saying about unsatisfying, maybe to people outside of the game B, that looks and sounds equally unsatisfying as the time banking. And hearing their perspectives would provide the feedback loops to actually understand what's still missing in that space. And it's not just game B. And as you said, it's like vaguely defined what exactly fits in it and what doesn't, right? But some kind of new initiative, those conversations, that feedback from those who kind of criticize the idea is invaluable, right? And yeah, maybe with the whole time banking, again, I would love to have, and then there's several time banking initiatives, right? And maybe we can have a conversation where we bring a panel of time banking pioneers, and then we can bring in someone who totally thinks like doesn't like that idea, right? And thinks it shouldn't really be happening, right? And then see what can emerge out of that conversation. And maybe also practice to have these conversations on a more broader level, right? Not just in somebody's office somewhere or in somebody's backyard, but actually on a more public level and see what we can get from also this public engagement and feedback from the people. So possibly that's a direction as well that we could go with this panel in the future.
yeah, that would be fun. I would like to hear from people that have been more deeply immersed in time banking and what what they like about it, and if they see what they make of it. Really,
Mm.
I mean,
So
obviously, for me as a philosopher, like you've got the word time in it, and you've got the word banking in it. You know, so like I could that's just a can of worms to me. Like we're treating time as the commodity, like
right.
of value, and then is like who needs more banks at this point? Like, but um,
And another last thing that I will just say for the record, so it stays maybe for me to reflect back outwards so I don't forget. One of the things you were saying, the most practical thing that could happen with like the biggest impact would be someone or like a group of people, but basically funding for these initiatives and projects. What I would like to inquire a little bit deeply more into is earlier in the conversation, you said that you said no to venture capital and essentially these investment rounds and all of that. And then there's still value and necessity for the funding. So it would be interesting to hear what's the difference between one approach and like, or the classical approach and the approach that you maybe would ideally want to see. So, but that again, that's a conversation for a different time, perhaps.
cool.
So,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
that'd be good. That's good. Let's bookmark that for sure.
fantastic. So, again, I said let's go to this conversation of consciousness and the role of that. And we kind of have 20 minutes left for the agreed time, and I don't want to keep you any longer than that. But I'm available, right, to continue the conversation a little bit beyond that. So I'm flexible because this conversation is another Pandora's box and could bring out all sorts of interesting directions that we can go with it. So, what my inquiry has been is, in my experience with the interactions with people that I've had an engagement in different projects as well, it's definitely helped to have a similar narrative, right? We can come together and we can just snap into action and understanding each other really well because the narrative in the background is almost the same in large kind of swoops, right? So now there are people who, when they hear the word consciousness and we need to understand our nature, they'll be like completely disengaged in the conversation and not willing to even go further because they have sidelined that as a non-scientific, like woo-woo concept, and we shouldn't be even going there. And yet those people may hold some important perspectives to the conversation. So again, ultimately it would be great to bring those perspectives in one conversation and to hear both sides. For our conversation today, though, what is that you think is essential for people to, and again, that question may be so broad that it would be worth another kind of whole series, but what is that insight, or what is that experience, what is that understanding, that narrative that is useful for, put very simply, bring about a better world, whatever that means again, right? That needs possibly a definition. But taken openly like that, what would you like to share in this area?
I think I would tie it back to when I was sharing originally about the 35-second clip from this guy's video that I was watching. Because I think I mean, I would either share the screen in the future, or I should have prepared the clip, or like we can put it in later, whatever it is. So, because I'd love to get it accurate. Sometimes I feel so, well, I'm using the word so lightly, like sad that I'm not like a photographic memory person. Like some people I listen to on podcasts, they just repeat things and they can draw. I'm like, oh, I wish I could do that. Because I want to get it like so. I want to like word for word, but really at the end of his sentence when he was talking about understanding our true nature and peace in the world, and how anything less than understanding that true nature will end up leading us down a path of the similar what we're experiencing now. His last sentence was something like, it's understanding we have a shared being. So like I don't know how to say that. I mean, I don't think it has to be dismissive, because like Christians have a word for that, and there's like billions of people on the planet who are Christians. Like Muslims have a word for that, so to say, and there's billions of Muslims. Scientists have a word for that, in a sense, or a mental model of that. They might call it, the unified field, whereas a Christian might call it the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, whatever, and then someone else might call it consciousness. So, but the message, or the knowing, or the experience, is to not only conceptually understand that we all, and this is again a premise if people don't believe it. So I admit that, like if this is something someone doesn't resonate with or understand, I'm talking like as a spiritual person or whatever. I'm trying not to like couch it in all those terms. Like I do believe there's enough people on the planet alive now and throughout history who would say the same, that makes it so. Like it's not just some confabulation of my or someone else's mind. there's a guy, a scientist, Donald Hoffman, right now who's working on evolutionary game theory, and he's saying he's he's pointing out that the physicists are saying that space-time is doomed, that it was a temporary model that did a lot of good for us, like having an idea that there's atoms in space and time and objects within space and time. This was a great model and set of hypotheses that allowed us in some ways to advance output of things for a better life. There's no question about it. But the theory will be transcended and included by a new paradigm, means a set of patterns, a set of beliefs that has to explain all the previous models, but it also will have new projected hypothesis that will try to prove. And if space-time can be doomed, like scientists would say that, then I don't see it really as impractical or ungrounded for me to say the most important thing would be for as many people as possible to understand that we all share the same being. And there's ways to describe that, in the type of non-duality that I'm a fan of. It's the idea that there is only infinite awareness. It's limitless. It's eternal. There's actually only one thing. David Bohm said this, a famous physicist: undivided wholeness. Like that's all there is, and everything else is an appearance within consciousness. Like my body is an appearance within consciousness. My body doesn't have consciousness. Like consciousness is the thing. Awareness is the thing. And I mean, then it gets hard to understand, and we need marketers, right? We need marketers to try to share that. I have no problem with that. That there will be marketers, and or the people who think like I do will be having so much fun on the planet that other people will have to start paying attention, just because like I'm having so much fun, and et cetera, and healthy and well, and I've got friends and I'm in love, and I'm doing good things in the world, and all of us are like that, and then we all happen to, like you say, have a shared narrative around oneness, or that's my big thing, like that we all have we are all sharing being, and we're all just expressions of that. And of course that just gets into, but there are different ways to talk about it. And seeing Donald Hoffman, I'll send you some videos, what him describe his own coming to understand these things, some of these things, even though he's a strict scientist. Like it just makes sense. Like the scientists too are coming to that conclusion. Like if it's not space and time is not really the fundamental nature, they don't know what it is. That's called the hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness come bootstrapped out of non-conscious material? Which the non-dualists say is the most inverted, unscientific thinking you could ever have. Like how does consciousness bootstrap out of non-conscious stuff? Like somewhere along the line in evolution, matter became conscious rather than it was always consciousness, and matter like is an expression of that. It's very complex, sophisticated, etc. But just like John Lennon said, I don't know, like Martin Luther King, like that we're all one, that we all share the same being, which on a practical level means if the Amazon is burning, we're all in trouble, right? It's not Brazil's problem when the Amazon's burning. People are coming to realize it's a planet Earth problem. And everyone, if we're going to wise up or see ourselves as one being on a more practical level, maybe, Alex, at least that's a good metaphor. Like a lot of people are waking up to the fact that like the Amazon being burned down is a global human challenge, not just the Brazil challenge or the government in Brazil's problem. If that whole forest goes away and all that, it could provide, it's on, we can't live on the planet altogether. So maybe that's more appropriate just to look at it like ecologically. And a lot more people are starting to feel that because of COVID and because of everything. And it's not too much of a further step to see your brother and sister and everybody, which is hard. I mean, it's because our experience tells us that we're separate beings. Like I'm over here, Alex is over there. My wife is over there typing. How could we be sharing one being when everything looks and tells me that we're separate beings? But everybody thought the Earth was flat at one time just because it looked that way. Like people thought we were going around the Earth was the center because it looked that way. Like just because it looks that way doesn't mean it's necessarily like that way.
I like how Deepak Chopra puts it, the superstition of matter. Like we need to get
I'm
past.
really, I'm super on board with that. Like, I'm not as expert as some of the people in that space, but that is my, I just, I admit, I'm completely like, I believe this is the fundamental revealing of this idea of separation and and all that. And it doesn't take away science. You wouldn't stop doing science at all. Period. Like, they're not mutually exclusive. It's just what paradigm are you going into the scientific inquiry with? Like, what fundamental this is that like ontological primitive. Like some people are going into it with consciousness as primary, and that informs their hypothesis and their experiments. And some people go in seemingly with matter, no matter how much they want to believe in other stuff. They're it's in their DNA, in their cells, that matter is here. Like it exists. And I agree with Deepak, and he has good conversations with Donald Hoffman. So anyone who likes both spirituality and science, I super recommend like looking up Donald Hoffman and Deepak conversations.
Awesome. And as you were sharing that, I remembered this idea that what defines science, what is science, or what is a good science. And I can't remember who that quote is by, but the idea was that good science is where you look for evidence that disprove your hypotheses, whether bad
Mhm.
science is that where you're looking for evidence that prove your hypothesis. Well, but that works both ways, right? Like if, as you're saying, your premise is like look for matter, well, you're going to be looking for science that proves that hypothesis, right? And I guess I don't know what the answer is. That's for the scientists to decide how to deal with that problem, right? But yeah, it's fascinating conversation, and it is in the realm of science also a huge conversation, right? There's so many conferences and even podcasts and whatnot about consciousness. But on an individual level, it seems like there's the intellectual understanding, the philosophical understanding of it, that we are all one being at the core. And then there's the experience of that. And I
And then
wonder,
stabilizing it as well, like living from it. So I'm personally in the process of I've had a lot of peak experiences, like going back to my life story, like a lot of insight experiences, but I was never able to really integrate it into like my experience and then live from it. So I'm even 25 years later from my first kind of foray into self inquiry in this path I've been on myself, which is who am I? Like to ask who am I is kind of my spiritual path. I was a fan of Ramana Maharishi. The question, I mean, not necessarily the Hindu religion, but the question, the where it came from is the Vedas and all that stuff. Um, I'm right in the moment right now, working to really keep landing it as an experience so it informs my activities and my choices. And that's way, like you're saying, it is way different than an intellectual understanding. And I've made some leaps in the last few months, but still 24 out of the last 25 years, it's still mostly been an intellectual, rational type of
well,
understanding where I'm living from. Like it's deeply ingrained in me because I had a ton of what they call level, like states, like peak experiences that have shown me what I kind of know to be true in my deepest of hearts. But then it's like that power, the metaphor of going back to sleep. Like I literally had the experience that we're all one being, not just mentally, like an experience of it. And then before you know it, the next day I'm like yelling at someone or I'm angry all the time. Like, and that if I am living from that knowing, I'm less like it wouldn't mean I wouldn't get angry or something. Like I'm still human, but it would just be, I think, far less often, and it would be easier to snap back into like my true knowing, et cetera, et cetera. So it clearly is way different to live from it than to just have the knowing. But I believe that's what human, I mean, just conscious evolution, like that's the new game. Like, I mean, I call it game D for fun, for divine. And because I have to be different, because I don't like to join things. um, but yeah, that's the game to me that the consciousness is playing, like deeper and deeper self-aware awareness of itself, and then we create from there, and that's what
And
I'm
I
excited about.
and I love the peak experience premise, and it seems like if there was one light, guiding star towards experiencing and understanding this idea of that we're all one at the core, looking for these opportunities to reach this peak experience is one good premise, I guess. And there are many ways how to achieve that, and it's quite exciting. I mean, we all know that in indigenous cultures, there have been for thousands of years ways to access these types of experiences as well. And it's very fascinating to see that now it's getting into even mainstream psychology, and there are, um, what do they call it? Do they literally call it like psychedelic therapy or something like that? You know, where there's different things like psilocybin and others that they use in this very, mainstream. In this case, it's I guess useful that it's getting into the mainstream, right? To use this concept in this context. And well, maybe that's the new revolution on the level of individuals. It's like making this experience, um, controlled is not the right word, but like facilitated by professionals, by experts. And scientists themselves are now saying that it has huge potential to address or to discover the answers to the questions that you yourself were saying. Well, who am I, and what is life, and what are we doing here? And they say that for people, it's one of the most impactful experiences of their life. Is there anything that you can also, from your experience, maybe, or what you've come across, can suggest in addition to that? Because it's very early stages. That I'm not even sure if anybody can just walk into a lab like that and sign up for that kind of experience. It's probably still all experimental. So, is there something else that you can suggest people that they can do to access these peak experiences?
Well, just to be clear, it's from my perspective, it's not necessarily the peak experiences that we're after, or that provide the revelation, or the medicine. Um, it feels like the most important thing people can do is learn, experiment with. I almost want to say, I had a saying for me when I was young. Well, no, 12 years ago. So basically, I'm 45 now. When I was 19, I had a psychotic episode or a spiritual emergency, depending on how, again, what paradigm you're coming from or what culture. In an indigenous culture, they may have pulled me aside and said, "You're gifted. You've got the gift of vision or healing. We're going to train you, and you're this breakdown that you've had, this crazy experience that you've had is just a sign that you're ready, and that this is your archetype maybe, and this is your role in our community, and not everyone will have this type of experience, but it's I don't know how they would say it exactly. I haven't spent time. I'm just going by what I've heard and like reading things and stories. But I think it would be something like that. Like it certainly wouldn't be pathologized, that's for sure. So I was in New Jersey in the US, so I got labeled with bipolar disorder and put into the mental health system and all that. Which is another topic I'd like to also talk to you about another time, mental illness, the mental health reformation, and other people in that space, and just a lot of things. But in 2011, I came up with a saying for myself, which was passion is the gateway drug. Um, because in America, they used to say marijuana is a gateway drug. So if you smoke marijuana, you end up doing cocaine and all the other drugs. So it's a gateway to taking all the harder drugs.
Right.
So I like to play with words. And um, but having that as my own mantra, that passion is the gateway drug, that's what I would recommend to people. Like, psychedelics can do certain things. There's a famous saying, it's like going to the wedding, but you can't stay. So they might open doors, and especially the new stuff, like the new modalities, they're appearing very useful for actually healing things, not for peak experiences. So for healing trauma or PTSD or depression or anxiety. So they're used in conjunction to help people actually heal, like physical, bodily, soul level type of uh, diseases, you know. Um, but if you follow your passion and follow your bliss, like trust your intuition, trust what you've always wanted to do in life, like not what your parents told you or what your society tells you or what your the voice in your head is telling you because your third grade teacher told you couldn't be an architect or something. Like, if you can experiment with following your bliss and following your passion and taking those kind of chances, you'll have an opportunity to experience what it is like to do that and to get in this flow, to reconnect with the flow, so to say. Not even like, so it's not like it's not actually it's there's from this perspective, there's no relationship or substance or thing outside of yourself that could actually give you happiness. I think what's happening on the planet, Alex, related to what you said, why it's just a slow progression. Psychedelics started in the 40s and 50s and they got outlawed and blah blah blah. And we've lost 50 years of research because of dogma and the patriarchy and all this other kind of stuff and fear, whatever, that we could have already been doing this for 50 years if it would have just been allowed to naturally happen without getting corporatized and monetized and governmentized and all that kind of stuff. So the people want to be happy. Like, people, if you just use the word, and again, and every religion has a word for it, like, people want to be happy. And I think if you look at the history of stuff in literature and history, like, I think there's a general evolutionary understanding unfolding en masse to what Jesus or Buddha would have said 2,000 years ago, or Lao Tzu or something, like the perennial wisdom of what those little peak peak people, peak people that brought like perennial timeless wisdom to the space. I think people are realizing that no kind of special car or job or relationship or drug is actually it going to give them the happiness that they're actually seeking. Like, it might work for a year or a decade or a month, but evolutionary speaking, I think people are turning on to that, which has a deeper, poetry, like with separation and consciousness. But on a practical level, I think more and more people, because of consumerism, possibly, and Generation X and the world the way it is, I'm sure psychologists could talk about that, or anthropologists. So I'm just so speaking as a super generalist level. I think people are actually turning on to the idea that the kingdom of heaven is within. So the more people follow that inner call and this inner call, that's what will provide the happiness, more than even a peak experience or something. The peak experience is what they do is they usually shake you up. They show you something else, that there's maybe more than you bargained for, or more than you thought about, or things are not what they might appear. They tend to crack what's called the ego, to let in extra information and things like that. So I love peak experiences. I mean, relatively speaking. Um, but none of them ever sufficed, I would say, Alex, compared to doing the work of asking who am I and sticking with that and like getting the fruit of that getting the fruit of that inquiry. That's like it's not always easy or what we want, so to say.
Yeah, and following one's passion and following one's bliss is not a cheap thing as well, right? It takes some courage and it takes some commitment. Um, and I guess, well, it's definitely a conversation in its own right, for sure. Um, I wonder what has been for you the experience, or maybe the process, or some kind of again on a practical level, um, an insight that you can share that helps you to follow your bliss.
In 2010, I came across a video by a guy named Vishen Lakhiani, who is now the like CEO of something called Mind Valley. It's a digital publishing company in the kind of personal transformation space. And he was running his first of many eventually called events called Awesomeness Fest. And he did this kind of TED Talk type thing. And he said, here's the 6 steps to awesomeness. And I'll find them for you. I can't believe I can't just reel them off. But it's like know what you want, be in flow, have embodiment practice, find other people like you, and a couple more. Um, and to me, that's practical. Like that's actually practical advice. Like know what you want. Like, do you want to be rich and famous? Do you want to be self-realized? Like, do you want to be a philanthropist? Do you want to be a race car driver? You know, whatever. Like, know what you want. Um, hang around other people that like want what you want, or can inform you. Have an embodiment practice. Like, be in flow. I mean, be in flow a little ambiguous, but there's you have to do it. You have to try it. Like, you have to experiment. Like, for me, practically speaking, in 2011, before this last chapter of my last 10 years, where I ended up finding new amazing friends, getting married, you know, somehow traveling the world with no official job and not a regular consistent income, and seeing awesome things and being gifted all these experiences, spontaneous wedding at the Uplift Festival in 2014, like meeting people I admired, building prototype technology, like all this stuff I've done. If you want to consider it practical, in 2011, I was living on state sponsored money because of the mental health background, which is a long story, but I was given like 800 US dollars a month. And I had a voucher which allowed me to get a nice, decent apartment for $100 a month. Right. So I was practically speaking, I gave it up. I said, look, I might be in a position now, I'm 38. If I don't do something different, to follow my kind of dreams that I really originally wanted to do before I kind of got lost in the muck of illness, perceived mental illness, and all this day programs and socialization. Like, I wanted to be a psychonaut. I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to be around geniuses. I always was like, oh, I want to be like Einstein and them, where they hung out in those Vienna cafes, and Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and Einstein turned up, and before you know it, F. Scott Fitzgerald was there, and you had all these amazing people from these different disciplines. Like, that's the kind of life I wanted to live, and I wasn't living that life. I was living in fear, and I was living on safety of this money, this little bit of money, and my family giving me a car and letting so I can drive to the store, and I had some credit cards so I could get a guitar, you know, and get and buy Netflix or something like that. And practically speaking, I was like, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm concerned that if I keep taking this money, it's like a crutch. I'll just I'll end up being 95 years old in this apartment by myself with no friends hardly, and no relationships, and no a life unlived, you know, of regret or something like that. So and like my family wasn't of course crazy about that at first, because they had the traditional just worried about me, like what if he does that and he has another episode, or he falls again, and then he doesn't have this money available and this apartment available, and then we'll have to put him up. You know, like there was normal things that I had, like you're saying, it's not there takes some courage. This is like But practically speaking, like sometimes you got to quit your day job, like sometimes you got to push yourself or take a risk, a perceived risk anyway. So does that sound, I mean, it's a good story. It's good for to share like my actual experience. So I mean, that's the best. I feel like that's fair enough. It's the best teacher would be to share my actual experience. Is it a systemic answer to like what do we do? Probably not. But it's a story you're going to hear, I think, from a lot of people that you end up talking to. If you get into their personal journeys, you'll find, I'm sure, some super similarities, especially with depression and anxiety and all and similar diagnoses and all that. People will have many people in this space will have similar stories, and it'll be awesome to hear about how they found answers in new ways. Because ultimately, when I talk to people about this bipolar thing, I don't believe there's one answer. Like take vitamin C or do yoga or take lithium. It's more existential than that, like having the bipolar experience or depression. Like everyone has a different prescription, you know, that they that will ultimately work for them. Although I do think if you can follow your bliss, that's like a kind of fundamental prescription. Go out there and find a way to be passionate about something and stick to it and just let life let life show up for you.
Yeah, and I mean, it is also a systemic answer in somewhat in what you're sharing, because it seems like these catalytic experiences are common, in people's lives, which push them into some kind of new trajectory and really let them see life and world and themselves differently. And some of the also stories that we hear are near death experiences, right, where people came back and now they are ready to live with passion, or some illness that they managed to get over and heal, and now they're living their life with passion. And in humanistic psychology, they talk a lot about this idea of contemplating on your death, and that it can actually bring you somewhat close to this catalytic experience, where actually deeply contemplating on uh, that we're not eternal, right, and that we will at one point will have to end our life, and without falling into these super what's the right word, uncomfortable for sure, but these unpredictable and uncontrollable experiences, I think somewhat we can choose to go into these contemplations in a more controlled way and intentional way, and yet achieve similar um, realizations and similar insights.
Right on.
And
I think we can create
feels
the
like,
right I think we can create conditions for that for people, like you're saying, with all the different technologies from psychedelic to virtual reality to living environment to community environment. I think, like you've been saying, that's where the game is at. Like, how do we take the next step to provide better and better soil and environments and tools for people to have like the overview effect, right? Astronauts go into space, the overview effect is called. They see the Earth from space and they actually have a consciousness shift. So I used to joke there's something called the co-creator effect. The more you follow your bliss and find people you love, and like you're saying, and self-organize and follow your passion and give up dogmas and all that, you start to see the world differently. It's easier to see that we're all interconnected when you do that, just like it's easier to see the Earth as one living system when you're out in space. And they're going to try to create the overview effect through VR right now. So there are certainly, like you're saying, like systematic, modern, ways that we can increase the likelihood of people, as Timothy Leary said, turning on, tuning in, turning on, and he said dropping out. So I've changed that to turn on, tune in, turn on, and co-create. But I that that's a nice way to kind of round it up. Like I think you can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not speaking overall like absolute terms. It's kind of a lot of what you're like inquiring about. Like how do we scale up
Right.
Game B, if that was game B, like let's just say game B is about helping people find themselves so that they are in the best position to be the farmers of the soil. Like, how do we? What's the next step of that? Like, how do we? How is it not just a random story of Brett or Alex, having a bipolar diagnosis and having to have 10 years for me? I always said I had a dark decade of the soul. Fuck a dark night. For 10 years, I wanted to kill myself because I couldn't get the help and the context I needed. I just kept getting, pharmaceuticals and people telling me to think differently or whatever. So yeah, it would be a shame if it it was only ever like available, through that. But I guess you could say COVID, in the current situation is almost like a planetary level existential catalytic event. And you probably more familiar. I would assume psychology and other disciplines also have noted sometimes people need to feel threatened or sick or whatever, or to have a shock to their system in order to even go into the space of asking questions or something like that. So it's a very interesting, like you're saying, like there's a naturalness to it. When it's your time,
Mm.
but it doesn't mean we can't take all of our learnings and create centers and outlets and tools that are, yeah, just make it like more accessible for people to turn on to that.
And there's a reason why now. Well, I don't know whether it's now how recent that is. I haven't tracked the timeline of that, but there are centers who focus around supporting people going through spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency, right? Depending on how you want to look at that. And they're also mainstream clinical psychologists, right? And that's starting to be more and more acknowledged. And I guess, amongst other things, that's also a useful conversation to have on a more public level. So it's not
Mm.
just somewhere like a fringe opportunity for people. So
Yes,
that they have access to these kind of opportunities.
absolutely.
Wow. So, okay. Well, this sounds somewhat like a good completion for this conversation. And I think at this moment, it feels like delving more into the game B and defining what that is, because you mentioned that a lot, and it is out there in the space and getting, I think, more and more traction. You hear it in all sorts of podcasts and read about it in articles. So it'll be useful, I think, to share a little bit more about that in more detail. What do you reckon?
That'd be great. My record must be in the Game B group. I would recommend you send a message to that guy Jim Rutt, who sort of kind of spearheaded the Game B coming into fruition. I think with Jordan Greenhall and some other people like 10 years ago. He would be a. I mean, obviously there's probably stuff with him online, but I think it'd be great for you to nudge him and see if he'll do an interview with you to have like what's the word, canonical, is that the right word, like this canonical, like here's the interview where one of the people. I don't think Game Beat will be that eventually, but at least it would be great to have on file, like on video, somebody who was been in that meme, you know, from the beginning and really hear from him. What does it mean to you? How do you guys all define it? Where did it come from? It'd be great to hear the story of. I think he started in the New Mexico Institute, Santa Fe Institute, or something. So I would definitely look him up and ask him if he would come on, and I would even ask him to do 2 shows, like, one that's personal, like, tell me your story almost,
Mm.
like, without answer, like, just tell me the story of your, because he's an interesting guy, he's a futurist and all that, but, yeah, that would be it'd be good to have that to kind of to work from, to relate to, maybe, and work with, because I don't mind having a definition to start with. Like, of course, I wanna expand on it, but sometimes it's nice to have a working something to point at, like, game B is this, and then we can say, oh, but for me it's a little bit more than that, and but maybe it's evolving into this. But it would be cool to talk to him, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. That sounds great. So, Brett, well, thank you so much for opening up so many topics and sharing your journey and your experience. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we will continue. So, thank you
Yeah,
for coming.
thank you, Alex, for inviting me and for creating a good space where we could both talk and inquire. And I felt I felt like it was a pretty balanced, and I felt like I try to watch myself. Like I felt like it was a pretty good balance of a few long episodes when necessary, but in the flow. So I had a good time, and um, I'm glad. I'm always glad to share. I like sharing. I mean, I'm a talker, so I'm glad to share, and I'm glad to contribute to the early stages of your podcast and to try to help in any way. And it's nice to be able to contribute by doing something I love to do, right? Like it's not like just discussing these things and sharing my journey is something I love to do. And if it's nice to create an episode with you and to be part of that. And I'm super looking forward to what you might come up with and panels and conversations and introductions you might make to have conversations and all that based on what you learn and matching people and thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great if those two or those three people talk? So I want to also wish you the best endeavor and an awesome time in your partners. So I'm sure it's going to be awesome.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's been my pleasure likewise. And yeah, once again, thank you.